In 1978, David Coverdale emerged with one clear goal: to rebuild this career after the emotionally, financially turbulent end of his days fronting Deep Purple. And his goal was simple: put together this band that really had a return to just pure blues rock roots that had inspired him from the beginning. Hence, the birth of Whitesnake. Now, in those early years, Coverdale recruited musicians whose pedigrees already carried weight. He had John Lord on keyboard, and he was a fellow Deep Purple survivor as well. Guitar players Bernie Marsden and Mickey Moody. Neil Murray on bass, starting out with Dave Duck Dole on the drums, and then they would eventually bring in Ian Pace, also from Deep Purple. And as a result, they slowly built this reputation across the UK and Europe. This was what was referred to as Old Whitesnake. They recorded 4 solid albums that, while respected, unfortunately didn't make them commercial heavyweights. Now, by 1981, despite all this touring and a growing fan base, they weren't making much money, and the band was starting to get a lot of internal tensions happening. Whitesnake was actually teetering on the edge of collapse. But David Coverdale was determined, and he really wanted to reinvent the group, recapturing its original spark that drove him forward in the first place. So the band's fortunes turned with the 1982 release of Saints and Sinners. This was considered an album that marked the beginning of their recovery, even though it would really be the last quote-unquote Old Whitesnake album. And it really helped them on 2 fronts. It brought new life into the group, but it also caught the attention of Geffen Records in the US. And at the time, they were eager to tap into that British rock scene. And with Whitesnake, this was definitely with good reason, because even though Saints and Sinners was still that classic bluesy Whitesnake, there were 2 songs in particular that actually hinted at this new sound that they would take on: Young Blood and Victim of Love. Young Blood had that driving 4/4 groove, while Victim of Love has a bit more of a pop sheen to it, but it was definitely modern by all standards for that group. Also, 2 others would make it onto their 1987 release, Here I Go Again and Crying in the Rain. And an interesting note on that is that on Here I Go Again, the 1982 version had them singing, "Like a hobo, I was born to walk alone." While the 1987 version, the lyric would be, "Like a drifter, I was born to walk alone." I guess drifters were cooler and more trendy than hobos, apparently. But with renewed confidence, Coverdale began setting his sights on the American market, realizing that Whitesnake's future might well lie beyond its native shores. I could go on and on about Saints and Sinners, but we're talking about Slide It In. By late 1983, the band gathered in Munich's Musicland Studios in Germany to record what would become their 6th studio album, Slide It In. The original lineup for these sessions had Coverdale on vocals, Mel Galley and Mickey Moody both on the guitar, bassist Colin Hodgkinson and drummer Cozy Powell, as well as John Lord handling the keyboards. The thing about Mickey Moody is that he is a beast at slide with an overall bluesy style. John Lord was, of course, legendary on the organ. Cozy was that wild drummer that when playing would create this hurricane force behind anybody. And Mel Galley was about as versatile as they come. He brought an edge to that group, played the hell out of the guitar, and could sing equally well. And of course, Galley had some big shoes to fill, because before him was Bernie Marsden from that original lineup. And similarly, they're able to both sing very well and play. Definitely a lot in common with John Sykes, who would join the lineup later on. Producer Eddie Kramer, who's renowned for his work with Jimi Hendrix and others, was brought in at the suggestion of Geffen's A&R executive, John Colander. However, from the earliest days of recording, it was clear that not everybody in the studio was digging it. Kramer had a particular production style, and it really just didn't gel with the band. During rehearsals and recording sessions, the sound that Whitesnake had honed over the years of blues rock was really under scrutiny. Coverdale wanted to hit America and hit America hard. So he figured, okay, they've got a taste for raw rock energy and kind of more of that polished radio-friendly sound. And as the sessions progressed, tensions continued to surface. Mickey Moody, who had been one of Coverdale's earliest partners in the band, found himself at odds with the evolving direction that the group was taking. Moody had remembered that as soon as they started playing the new material, it felt as though the band had lost that familiar spark. I mean, for one, they just weren't the same band. I mean, they had Cozy Powell, who just had that heavy drumming style. Colin Hodgkinson brought a totally different vibe on the bass, and he had actually been brought in by Cozy because he had played with him on Cozy's album, Project Octopus, in 1981. but it was definitely a different band by that time. And then the situation with Mickey Moody reached a breaking point during a mini festival stop in Germany, where Whitesnake was actually sharing the stage with Thin Lizzy. After the gig, back at the hotel, Coverdale was seen interacting closely with John Sykes, hanging out with him, and then, of course, as we know, John Sykes played guitar with Thin Lizzy. In a moment that would be totally pivotal, Coverdale singled out Moody in front of John Sykes, telling him he was unprofessional, saying never turn your back on the audience again, and it just embarrassed the living crap out of Mickey. And that turned out to be really the last straw. He was done. So he told the tour manager that, hey, you know what? David Coverdale should just hire John Sykes outright. So Mickey Moody split in October 1983, and that was really the end of an era for the group. But it also cleared the way for a dramatic reshaping of the lineup, and Coverdale wasted no time. On the advice of the A&R rep, he started looking for an actual, what they considered, guitar hero to elevate the band's image and sound. Now, they tried to pick up Michael Schenker, but Schenker was like, oh no. Interestingly enough, they also tried to pick up Adrian Vandenberg, who would actually play with them much later. But at the time, he said no, he just wanted to focus on his own group at the time. But eventually, it all led right back to John Sykes, who had been touring with Thin Lizzy, and he was a bit reluctant about it because he was loyal to Phil Lynott, but they just kept on persisting. Coverdale was offering him an absurd amount of money to join, and eventually he agreed. And that right there was really the mark of the biggest change in the band. Now, I covered John Sykes in depth upon the sad news of his recent passing, but if there's anybody for the job in this band, it was definitely him. He had pushed the envelope on true shred guitar, and I mean full musical shred, long before it was even a thing. And while he reeled it in for this album, his playing style would shape this and the next album, 1987, in unimaginable ways. But at the same time that Sykes was being ushered in, another major shakeup was taking place. Coverdale kicked Colin Hodgkinson out, the bass player, because they just could not gel with him. And in his place, he brought in Neil Murray, the original Whitesnake bass player. And Murray's return was more than just a personnel adjustment. It was also part of Coverdale's broader vision for creating this record that would seamlessly blend the old Whitesnake blues rock with the new modernized sound geared toward the American market. And for those that know Neil's playing, his groove is very solid. Like John Paul Jones, when Jones played on tunes like the Lemon Song and Traveling Riverside Blues, for example, Neil Murray just has that knack for locking in with the drums while still maintaining this kind of loose feel. So in a way, it's ironic they would bring in such a grounded in the roots player like Neil, but it makes sense. Coverdale wanted that depth, and Murray was the perfect person to bring that depth. But during these wild recording sessions, another production change was definitely in the offing. Eddie Kramer, whose contributions had been pretty much limited to Guilty of Love and the Gambler single, was replaced by Martin Birch, who had a long history of working with Whitesnake. And at that time, he was working with all sorts of other groups. Iron Maiden, Deep Purple, Fleetwood Mac, and his production style was just more in line with the band's traditional sound anyway. But it also had to accommodate this kind of more heavier, more aggressive approach that they wanted to take. And with Cozy Powell and the fresh contributions of John Sykes, as well as Neil Murray back in the fold, they definitely had a pretty tight unit. But while all these changes were underway, Geffen Records still wasn't content with the album. Critics really ripped apart the original UK mix for its flat sound. And Geffen was like, oh hell no, this is not going to connect with the American audiences. So with the album already slated for a UK release on January 30th of 1984, the label commissioned a remix for the American market. And Coverdale wasn't initially happy with it, but he said if the album was to be remixed, then he also wanted the new parts recorded by John Sykes and Neil Murray. He wanted them integrated into the mix. And Coverdale said that's non-negotiable. But Coverdale was determined that the American version would reflect the new direction of the group. Now, the remix process began in Los Angeles on January 19th, 1984. And for that, they brought in Keith Olsen to produce, who had also worked with Fleetwood Mac and Rick Springfield. And his task was clear. He had to enhance the overall sound of the album, give Coverdale's voice much more punch, and ensure that the guitar and drum channels were amplified at the expense of keyboard and bass elements, sort of keeping in line with that heavier, more modern sound that was happening at the time. And Olsen would end up layering John Sykes' new guitar tracks over some of the original recordings, and of course having Murray re-record a lot of the bass parts as well. They didn't touch Cozy's drums that much, other than giving him a bit of boost in the highs. And they also brought in a bass player named Bill Cuomo, who laid down a couple bass parts as well. And what's interesting is that the result was a transformed record, but it still managed to maintain its core identity. But yet they were really able to flip the vibe on it. And so it ended up being released on schedule in 2 separate editions. In Europe, the album hit store shelves on January 30th, 1984, with the original UK mix, is what they call it. And then the remixed version would come out on April 16th, 1984, through Geffen Records. And that would be the American version. The critics and fans were presented with a record that was about as divisive as it was pivotal. Their longtime supporters found themselves kind of split into 2 camps. You had the purists, who really liked the old school blues-inflected sound of the early lineup. But then you had this whole new wave of fans that was really drawn to this kind of more polished but heavier version. But regardless of these differences, the album's impact was huge. In the UK, it peaked at number 9 on the charts, marking Whitesnake's 4th top 10 appearance there. And in the US, it actually climbed to number 40 on the Billboard 200, which was a big achievement considering just how hard that they had been working to try to get attention over here and could not. And it also really laid the groundwork for the band's subsequent breakthrough, 1987, the self-titled album. But Slide It In opens the record with this hard-hitting, straightforward driving riff, double entendre lyrics that hint at the band's playful yet determined approach to rock. And then he has Slow and Easy, and that was actually co-written by Coverdale and Mickey Moody. And that one is still drenched in blues, real powerful rocker, and that ended up becoming a major US single, hitting number 17 on the mainstream rock charts. Its tricky stops at the top of it, quick hits during the verses, made this one an instant arena favorite. Then you got Love Ain't No Stranger, which wasn't a typical power ballad. It's got a lot of depth in the acoustic intro, where Coverdale's voice had this really cool, mellow, bluesy touch, and then when the band kicks in, it's just epic. It's a fairly simple arrangement, but it really hit hard. Love Ain't No Stranger would also become one of the signature songs of Whitesnake's live shows. All or Nothing is a straight-out, hard-driving rock with some cool organ breaks from John Lord. The Gambler had this eerie, dark feel during the choruses, but it's interesting to hear the Purple influences creeping in here and there. But all through this album, Coverdale really just proved himself to be this powerful vocalist. And he always was. He always drove the band, but it was really put into a different light here over this kind of more modern hard rock sound that they had achieved. Guilty of Love is also interesting because of that dual guitar harmony, which is reminiscent of Thin Lizzy. Obviously, some of that wore off in terms of influence. Hungry for Love had that more of a fun party vibe. Give Me More Time is definitely a lot more pop-oriented, as is Standing in the Shadows. And actually, Standing in the Shadows might be the most dated track on the album, not in a bad way, but it really does have that full-on 80s feel. Then you got Spit It Out, and it's interesting because, like, on a song like that, you could tell that Cozy Powell was just having a blast playing the drums. And he had said that this was the most fun record for him to make. But all in all, the band made a huge transition to a more modern, arena-ready sound, and it just came through so strong on this album. But in addition to its sonic innovations, Slide It In was accompanied by a series of dramatic personnel and production changes that really just would reverberate through their history. And it's pretty wild how it all worked out. And you figure, while the recording sessions in Munich started with that established lineup, Coverdale, Moody, Galley, Hodgkinson, and Powell, and Lord, it would just be a few months, and they would start rapidly turning over. First Moody split, then they bring in John Sykes, then Coverdale fires Hodgkinson, kicking him out, deeming his playing incompatible with the band's renewed vision. So what's he do? But he brings back in Neil Murray. John Lord also had indicated his intention to leave because he really wanted to go back to Deep Purple. So Coverdale at least talked him into staying for the rest of the supporting tour. And the changes didn't end there. Cozy Powell, whose powerful and precise style had driven this new lineup, eventually found himself at odds with David Coverdale over money. So after the album's touring cycle concluded in January 1985, he was out. And then Mel Galley was forced to leave the group when an injury sustained during a stage stunt in Germany, where he broke his arm leaping off the top of a parked car, rendered him unable to continue playing. So his last appearance was recorded on April 5th, 1984 in Manchester, and then he was out. But the promotional tour for the album actually began in early February 1984. They'd rehearse in February, culminating in the European tour that kicked off in Dublin on February 17th. And there was a lot of energy in the group, but a lot of volatility as well. As Whitesnake crisscrossed Europe, the revised lineup, at that time featuring Coverdale, Sykes, Mel Galley until his injury, Neil Murray, John Lord, and Cozy Powell, faced a lot of challenges. Galley and Lord would both be out before they even hit the States, and they found themselves sharing bills with some established acts, from Quiet Riot to Dio, and MTV played a critical role during this period, with the heavy rotation of videos for singles like Slow and Easy and Love Ain't No Stranger, but that got Whitesnake out there. But all in all, Slide It In stands as one of their most solid albums. This particular lineup of Whitesnake was lean and mean, and it was a simpler time. And really this one, like its predecessor, is a straightforward, almost no-frills album, barring Coverdale's sometimes comical lyrical style. But it served as that perfect gray area between old-school bluesy Whitesnake and what they would become the all-out arena cock rock Whitesnake. But I've linked to my tribute of the great John Sykes, whose passing took us all by surprise. He was musically the strongest link to the Whitesnake musical chain, and his contributions to music will be sorely missed. So I want to say huge thanks to my subscribers, because you're just friggin' awesome. That's all I could say. And if you haven't had a chance to subscribe yet, make sure you go ahead and give that thing a good poke. And while you're at it, go ahead and poke that like button as well. Make sure you do it an odd number of times. Join the family. I want to thank you so much for watching.